Welcome to the Common Weal Policy Podcast. With me, Jonathon Shafi. I'm the Campaigns Officer here at Common Weal, and I am welcomed by... Sorry, I'm going to start that again. Because I'm not welcomed. I'm pleased to welcome. Welcome to the Common Weal Policy Podcast. With me, Jonathon Shafi. I'm the Campaigns Officer here at Common Weal, and I am joined this week by Dr. Craig Dalzell, who's the Head of Policy and Research at the think tank. Craig, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks, and good to hear you back after the wee break last week. We're having a bit of a special show today. We're not talking too much about Scotland for a change.
Yeah, we're going to focus on what's happening in the US elections. And of course, that has been dominating, not just in America, but right across the world because of the consequences of that election and because of the closeness of it as well. So there are loads of topics to talk about and lots of things to consider when we're looking at this result come in. We're going to have a conversation about this, but just to kind of kickstart that conversation, just as a really obvious point, the polls were really off, and we've been used to having polling not stand up to reality in recent elections. But this really does come as something of a hammer blow to the polling industry in the United States. They've got it very wrong. It's a very close race. We still don't know the winner. There could be various court cases. But Craig, what's your assessment of how this vote went?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we should preface this by saying that we delayed the podcast for a day to try and give time for the process to play out a little and maybe get some glimmer of a final result out of it. But as we're recording in the afternoon of Thursday, the 5th of November, the race is still too close to call. Biden is ahead. As we record at this moment, he has confirmed 243 electoral votes to 214, but there are still enough out there that it could go either way. Although, as we say, Biden is leaning towards a win. But what it is not is the landslide Biden victory that some of the recent polls were predicting. And I've been reflecting on this over the past day or so. And there'll be all kinds of analysis as we go through this. So this isn't the be-all and end-all of it. But what I think we've seen is electoral strategists have spent a lot of time looking at swing voters. Whenever you're polling, you're looking at the people who have changed their mind since the last election. What we've not been picking up in these polls, and what we've not been picking up in other polls and other elections where the polls have been similarly divergent from expected results, is that whenever you get an increase in turnout, you start having to talk about people who haven't voted before or haven't voted in several elections and sometimes don't engage with these polling surveys or talk to people or really express their opinion in any way that can be measured. So it's maybe no surprise that you're not factoring them into your calculations. And suddenly when they come out, the results skew. And it has been a remarkable increase in turnout in the presidential election. I saw accounts saying that it was the highest electoral turnout since 1900 for a US presidential election. In terms of in terms of democratic event, in terms of the democratic expression there, that's a success story of this. No matter who wins, the more people who vote in an election is a good thing. That said, it's still only about 2/3 of eligible voters, so there's still a huge chunk of voters there or potential voters there, who, if they could be captured in a future election by one side or the other, almost certainly they would turn the result from into a landslide victory for their side. The question is, how do you do that?
Absolutely, and we'll come on to talk about the state of American democracy. But looking at these turnouts, as well as turnout being big, we also have to say that Donald Trump's vote has gone up from 2016. He has added to his base over these last 4 years, and he has not just added white males. In fact, one of the analysis I've been reading is that he was down slightly on white males compared to 2016. But he has been adding a multiracial cohort to his base. There's all kinds of quite complicated reasons for that. But for example, 22% of black men with bachelor's degrees and 20% of black men with advanced degrees also supported Trump in the election. So we're also looking at shifts and Trump being able to capture some parts of the vote which have gone Democrat in the past, university educated being one of them. So there's lots going on here, and lots that will require, as you say, analysis as we go forward. But I want to ask you, keeping it to the here and now, just for the moment, I want to get your response and have a conversation about the way in which Trump has been dealing with the election so far. He did say that there would be no games on the eve of the election, that he would see the result as it came in, and there wouldn't be the kinds of shenanigans that he's now putting forward. But he is pouring fuel onto the fire here by claiming that there are fraudulent votes taking place, that the election has been stolen, in his own words, to an already riled up base who hang on his every word. That clearly is a very combustible situation that the president is stoking.
Yeah, I mean, in any government, in any power structure, the mechanism of a smooth transition is perhaps the most important part of that structure. You know, whether you're talking about a liberal democracy or whether you're talking about the succession of kings, you know, having that clear and smooth transition where you go from one administration to another, and even if you do not agree with them, even if they are your political and ideological opponents in every conceivable way, if the mechanism by which the power is transferred causes that transfer, then you accept it and you let the new administration come in. We've seen previous presidents, there's plenty of videos doing the rounds right now of previous presidents handing over power in televised addresses and saying, this is how the people have voted and this is how it shall be. You see that there's a tradition in America of the US president writing a farewell and welcome letter to their successor, and they all have a sense of passing over an office and saying, look, we all come into this with our own challenges, and but we do the best we can with it. But Trump is a person for whom losing is the worst thing that can happen. So we all expected a temper tantrum, and we're seeing it. What is perhaps more galling or more frightening is the way that several members of his administration are joining in. You've seen folk like Rudy Giuliani stoking that same fear of an illegitimate election, and it was the fear that was raised in a lot of the commentaries leading up to the election, that if Biden couldn't get a clear landslide, then these tensions could be stoked up, and they will be being amplified on social media and around the alternative media circles, and it's worrying. I hope that when the final tally comes in, the administration will settle down and it will have that smooth transition of power. But if the seed of doubt has already been planted, then what do you do with it? How do you put that away?
Well, that's it, isn't it? Because I agree with you when you say that Trump was probably always going to have some kind of tantrum, as it's being called by a great many people. And of course, look, that's true. We know what Trump's like as an individual, but it goes well beyond Trump the individual, doesn't it? This goes right into millions of Trump supporters who do hang on his every word and who have been subject to this idea that the election result has been stolen from them, that these mail-in ballots have been fraudulently cast in favour of the Democrats. Of course, that's a talking point which Trump has been deploying for weeks now about the mail-in ballot. And so to have a president turn around and say that the vote should stop being counted, that these perfectly legitimate ballots should simply stop being counted, does represent, I think, a real break and a real moment in the history of American democracy. And I think you're completely right to say that these seeds have now been firmly planted. So that's not going to be a dynamic which shifts anytime soon. We're not going to be in a situation where, if, as we expect, Biden becomes the president, then there's going to be this sense of, well, it was a fair election, it was held, and therefore that's the outcome. So these dynamics are going to continue to play. I think American society is going to become even more polarised as the situation goes on. I actually don't think we're going to have seen the last of Trump either, not by a long way. And by that, I don't just mean he might set up his own TV channel or remain a figure in American public life. I think he will have and play a distinctly political role. And there's a big question, which I now want to throw to you, about what does the Republican Party do here when it comes to Trump? Because on the one hand, Trump could be really a carcass which they have to carry around with them, someone who will constantly take the limelight away from the development of other individuals in the party who they will need to develop in order to stand at future elections and from their point of view, win future elections. But on the other hand, and this is where I'll pass over to you, on the other hand, they might also look at what Trump's done and think, well, we've never had these kinds of voter demographics coming in our direction. We've never had these rallies on the scale that we've seen. There's a lot of energy and a lot of life around the Republicans. Is this what the modern Republican Party now has to do? So what do you think they're going to do, assuming that Trump loses the presidency?
Yeah, it's just on the idea of stopping the ballot. It's also quite interesting that you're seeing him call for the ballots to keep getting counted in certain states as well. But
Absolutely.
the distinction between the two is whether or not he is currently winning or losing. So he seems to just want he wants the votes counted until a point where he is in the lead, and then stop. So that's a fairly. I mean, that's a tactic you could have probably predicted coming from Trump if you'd predicted him to be going after it in this way. On the future of the Republican Party, I mean, yeah, I suspect that he might play a continued role in the frontline Republican Party. I don't see him as someone who will be content just becoming a state governor somewhere or taking a Senate seat or something like that. Of course, there's not a huge amount of precedent for a former president to remain in frontline politics in that way. They often become the kind of elder statesperson and advisor. He might become the guy who does the Republican fundraisers and rallies. If he is the person that is able to turn out those numbers rather than the policies or the ideology or the party, then I could see a role for that in him. But is that a role that he wants to take? Well, we'll see. He did. He has threatened to simply leave the country if he loses in the past. He's threatened to come and live in Scotland if he lost the presidency in 2016. So who knows? He's not someone who will simply fade away. He will always have some other venture, some other thing to slap his name on. Perhaps that media empire will be the thing he focuses his attention on after this.
It's interesting, isn't it? And we'll have to see where it all goes. But the Republicans have got a lot to think about moving forward. I think, though, that they must be feeling to themselves that, well, we were expecting the potential of a landslide defeat. And at the present moment, although there is still a very narrow path that may open up for the Democrats to take control of the Senate, depending on what happens in one of the Senate races in Georgia. There may be two runoffs for the Senate in January, which could decide the balance of power in the Senate. But assuming that things are as they stand, the Republicans will control the Senate. Now, here let's turn to Joe Biden and the Democrats. I think that Joe Biden, as president, will come under various forms of pressure. On the one hand, he's got to look at the fact, and the Democratic establishment have got to look at the fact that who brought the young voters, who brought any new life to the Democrats over the last few years and during this election. It is figures like AOC and Bernie Sanders and the squad. They are an important part of what composes the Democratic Party now because of the kinds of people that they can motivate and energise. On the other hand, they've got to look at the fact that the Senate will probably be run by the Republicans, and Joe Biden has talked in very stark and very focused, should I say, terms about the fact that he's going to be a bipartisan president. He sees that as the kind of role that he would play, which is not a surprising one given the politics of Joe Biden. But he can't go too far in that direction at risk of losing support at the other end. The Democrats have to think very carefully about how they're going to play this. My view is that probably what Biden will be thinking is, can he build up some kind of relationship, some kind of dynamic with the American people that is a different one than they have known so far. So when he is making presidential statements and conducting news conferences and all that kind of thing, that can be a powerful tool that he has to try and define himself as a president. Craig, what do you think about where the Democrats go from here? And bearing in mind, this isn't the landslide that they were clearly hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we'll see will be determined primarily by the relationship they have with the Republican Party, and I think that will be fairly predictable because we've already seen a track record of what happens when you have a Democratic president and a hostile House and Senate, and that is the Republican Party will probably be as obstructionist as possible. We saw that under Obama, typified when they deliberately shut down the process of him nominating a new Supreme Court judge when he had the opportunity to do so because there was an election coming up, and they swore absolute dead that this was the new way it was going to happen. And you could broadcast their words back to them if the situation ever came up again and the roles were reversed. When the roles were reversed, famously this year, they flipped. Suddenly, no, it is absolutely imperative that the Republicans nominate the judges of their choice. So I fully expect them to flip again and simply become as obstructionist as possible. And people are already predicting that if the Senate does not go the Democrats' way, then Biden could spend the first 2 years of his term being a lame duck president, unable to pass legislation. I'm not entirely sure that will be the case because, again, there is another track to this. Obama actually opened the way for this to a degree when he was that president who didn't have the house under him who was loyal to him or following him. Then he had to do a lot of his work through executive order. And executive order is powerful in America, where the president can simply write legislation. But it's also very, very limited in what it can do. And one of the things that it's really limited in is it can amend and repeal previous executive orders. And this is something that Trump used. When Trump came into power, he did a lot of legislation via executive order. And what he mostly did was overwrite and repeal a lot of what Obama did. So when Biden comes in, if he can't do what he wants through the Congress and the Senate, then he might start doing it through executive order by overwriting a lot of what Trump did.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
you can completely expect the Republicans to be very unhappy with this. Shouldn't this be a Democratic president and a president who works with the government to pass that stuff? Oh, we're not going to pass anything, but you should be going through us rather than the executive order. This is authoritarian socialism, except it's exactly what Trump and Obama did before him. And it's what he will be probably forced to do unless he can take control of the Senate.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, not to go too much off in a tangent, because I think these things are very much connected. But there were other issues that were being decided upon at these elections in various parts of the United States. We did see, for example, the question of the minimum wage being put into practice and being raised in Florida, I believe, and that was voted in favour of by those who took part in the election. It does strike me as just interesting that the Democrats couldn't win in a place where you did have a rising support around the question of the minimum wage. You also look at some of the exit polls, and exit polls in American elections are very interesting in the sense that they're not really exit polls as we know them, but you look at various issues. Mm-hmm. And if you look at some of the big issues, for example, do people support health access for all and all of these big questions, then actually you find that when it came to gun control, when it came to health and the need for public health, that there were substantial majorities in favour of these things. But there's no party that really represented public health care, for example. And so there's a wider democratic deficit going on here, isn't there? Which is rooted in the way the two-party system works and how controlled American politics is. I mean, many people have commented on this, but given the choice was Joe Biden, who's clearly at points in the campaign been suffering from cognitive decline, and someone like Donald Trump, does say something deeper, doesn't it, about the nature and the state of American democracy. What's your view on this? Because we know that there are millions of people who are just completely disenfranchised. Even if they did vote, are they really represented in the American system?
I mean, it's such a vast country with such a huge population that trying to boil that down into the representation of one person is obviously going to be impossible. They do have an advantage under their federal system. The states have a huge amount of power to legislate on issues. I mean, there's been states that have been passing laws to legalize and decriminalize drugs, for instance, as well. Something that is quite a hot topic in Scottish politics at the moment. But Scotland doesn't have the power to do that, whereas the individual states in America do. So to say that folk aren't represented isn't perhaps entirely true. They're just maybe not represented at the federal level, but at the state level, there's maybe more nuance going on there. But yeah, at the federal level, you have these parties that are, well, especially the Democratic Party, very much chasing the centrist position. And we've seen the failure of that in so many elections across Europe as well. Our director, Robin McAlpine, wrote an article on this yesterday as we record, talking about the collapse of centrism and the fact that if you're just constantly chasing the blandest possible manifesto in the hope of pleasing everyone, what you actually do is alienate everyone. So
yeah.
In that respect, it's actually a bit of a wonder that Biden has managed to increase turnout for this election.
And that, I think, does kind of bring the kind of some of the dynamics I was talking about previously into play. Because if you look at the enthusiasm levels for how people were voting, were they voting because they were big fans of the candidate or because they were real opponents of the alternative, then you look at the numbers for Biden, and huge numbers of people voted for Biden. Let's be clear about this. Huge numbers voted for Biden on the basis that they just wanted Trump out of the White House. But that's not that, they're going to have to look deeper in the future about how they build up their support. And this is where I think the left of the Democrats play an important role, and why the Democrat establishment is going to have to, if it wants to be successful, is going to have to consider that in full. But of course, I don't think they will. I think they are ideologically fused to the politics of the centre, and that's why having a Republican Senate, well, Joe Biden might not be overly displeased about that, because lots of the legislation that they will put through allows him to pivot his presidency to a whole number of in a whole number of directions, and probably quite a lot of it are things which they would support. I mean, if we look at fracking, for example, the left of the Democrats are not going to be supportive of that, but many Democrat establishment people will be. So there's lots of things to consider about that. I should say as well, when it came to Florida and the minimum wage, just to say that the vote there was to increase the minimum wage to $15 per hour, and that was passed. They achieved the necessary 60% support needed to pass. So it's interesting, isn't it, that these issues are not necessarily lined up with how people are voting in terms of their party. Many people might vote for an increased minimum wage and then go in the very same day and vote for Donald Trump. So lots going on there, which will need a lot of work and analysis to pour through. I just want to ask the last question then, Craig, and you touched on it there, which is about really the failure of centrist politics. But lots of people talk about this in the context of elections and electoral fortunes and so on. But I wanted to ask you about it in the context of the big challenges that humanity faces. I mean, if you look at climate change, you look at the vast inequality that scars our societies, you look at any number of big issues, and you can see these kinds of crises developing. And the centre ground, they just don't have the answers for this. They're not willing to undertake the kind of policies, many of which you've been working on, Craig, that can actually bring about change, the change that we need in the time that we've got, especially when it comes to things like climate change. So what do you see going forward here? Because clearly we're going to have to get to grips with this. So I wanted your view on that. And then I wondered if you could tie that into answering about this as well, which is that, what do you think the international consequences of the US election are? Because they do get so much attention from people right across the globe because of the position the Americans and the American state have within the global system. So I think those have got some combined answers myself, but what's your view?
With the possibility that Biden could have a very close result and potentially even having that lame duck experience, I mean, the world might just kind of look at America and almost think, well, now we don't need to pay attention to the president's Twitter feed for a few years, breathe a sigh of relief, and sort of worst case, if America just sort of spends a couple of years not doing much on the world stage, it gives the rest of the world time to do stuff without being really worried about what Trump will tweet at them if they do it. There was an insight I saw to do with the centrism thing. It was that if your opponent is going to decry you as the worst kind of socialist possible, and who you are is Joe Biden with the most moderate centrist position possible, then what is the point in policy restraint? You're going to be attacked for being something you're not. There's no loss in becoming that thing. And Biden right now, when it comes to climate change, yes, he has committed to signing up to the Paris Accord, again, because today, as we record, the US has now formally withdrawn from the Paris Accord and the climate change targets that it entails. Biden has promised that if he becomes president, then on the first day of his presidency, he will rejoin. But he has also, over the course of the campaign, vehemently denied that he wants to shut down the fracking industry. So he's
exactly,
in that centrist position, trying to please everybody with a position that will actually please nobody, because he cannot meet his Paris Climate Accord targets without shutting down the fracking industry. So who is he actually making the promise to?
exactly.
So yeah, if he's really going to commit to the climate change accord, then he's going to have to do these things that he's going to be attacked for by his opponents, but they're attacking him anyway, so he doesn't actually lose anything. So this is maybe where the Democratic left can use their voice and their leverage and say, well, if you're going to get attacked for doing it, why not do it?
Well, we're going to see what's going to come ahead of us in due course, of course. But I think you're right. When it comes to these big questions, we're going to have to see radical action, and we're going to have to build the kind of campaigns and movements and political representation for those movements necessary to get this done. Because the longer we go down this road, the more difficult it becomes to actually address the problem of climate change. And our societies, as they currently are, they are not functioning in the needs and not meeting the needs of ordinary people right across the board. And I think that's something that will express itself in further political volatility. So this election in America has been an unexpected result for many people, but I'll just say that we are not going to be reaching any kind of political calm anytime soon unless these big economic and social questions are tackled. And Common Weal is working hard on all of those big questions. Craig, as the head of policy, I know that you are writing and thinking about policy all of the time in terms of how we're developing Common Weal. So I just wondered if you wanted just to give just a flavour of some of the stuff that you're working on. I've been particularly drawn towards, apart from the Resilient Scotland papers, your work on the traffic light system for COVID. I think there was a lot in there, which is really, really important. But anything you want to say just as a way of wrapping up the podcast?
Oh, and there's so much in that traffic light paper, the warning lights, it's called, that COVID response paper that has since been picked up by the Scottish Government, from the tiered system as a whole through, even just today, the First Minister announced that they were going to be investigating ways of increasing testing capacity across Scotland by using what's known as pooled testing. So very, very briefly, what you do is you take samples from, say, 10 people and you combine them together and you do one analysis on that combined sample. And if it comes up negative, then all 10 people are negative. Therefore, you don't need to test them all individually. You save time, you save resources. If it comes up positive, at least one person in the group is positive. Then you test them all individually and you find who it is. It was interesting that Nicola Sturgeon said that Scotland was ahead of the curve in developing techniques like this. Well, she's not really, because colleges in America have been using this technique for months now, and countries in Africa have been using it since the start of the pandemic. But it's good to see. It's good to see that more ideas are getting picked up. On future ideas, I should say that as we're recording this on Thursday, tomorrow, Friday the 6th of November, there is going to be a major policy announcement that we have been involved in. I cannot talk about it on the podcast today, but it is going to be huge. I promise you, if it comes to pass, it seriously could utterly change the Scottish political landscape. I'm very excited about it, but can't tell you. So maybe that'll be the topic for next week's podcast.
Well, that's a great way to end the conversation, Craig, and thanks for that. And as you point out, we'll have lots to discuss in the next edition of the podcast. As we always say, if there's anything that you would like us to talk about, any questions you have, or any topics that you would like to put forward for discussion in the podcast, then do get in touch with us. The details to do so will be below the link of this podcast. And with that, we'll be back next week.